The Montana night was a beast of wind and ice. It howled across the plains, tearing at the few skeletal trees and kicking up a gritty mix of dust and snow that stung the eyes and scoured the skin. It was the kind of cold that seeped into the bones, that promised no dawn, only a deeper, more profound darkness. Under a sky like bruised velvet, Lila rode, her stolen mare, a gaunt, lathered shadow against the monochrome landscape. Stumbled often. Each misstep sent a jolt of fear through Lila, a cold echo of the desperation that was her constant companion. Her wedding dress, a mockery of white satin and lace, was now a tattered, mud-stained shroud, ripped at the hem and shoulder, streaked with dark patches of blood. Some her own, some from the stable hands she'd fought in her scramble for freedom. The delicate fabric offered no protection against the biting wind, clinging to her freezing skin like a wet rag. Her breath plumed in ragged gasps, each one a shallow victory against the exhaustion that dragged at her. She'd ridden since moonrise, pushing the mare past its limits, past her own. Her hands, stiff and raw from gripping the reins, throbbed with an insistent pain. Her legs, chafed and bruised, felt like lead. But the thought of Eli Barton, his heavy hands, his cruel eyes, the glint of his gold wedding band on her finger, was a whip. It drove her onward, a terror so visceral it overshadowed the gnawing hunger, the freezing cold, the certainty of pursuit. Eli Barton. The name alone was a cold knot in her stomach. He was a man who owned half the Yellowstone Valley, a man whose wealth was matched only by his ruthlessness. He'd bought her from her desperate father, a rancher ruined by drought and bad luck. The wedding had been a carnival of false smiles and veiled threats, a spectacle of her unwilling sacrifice. She'd seen the look in his eyes, the proprietary way he'd touched her arm, and a primal fear had ignited within her. That fear had given her the strength to bolt, to fight, to steal a horse from his sprawling ranch and ride headlong into the unforgiving wilderness. The mare faltered again, a soft wicker of protest dying on the wind. Lila knew it was the end of the line for the poor beast. And for her, her head spun, a dizzying mix of fatigue and the lingering effects of a blow to her temple during her escape. The blizzard, gathering strength with every passing hour, was a solid wall of white, blurring the horizon, swallowing the world. She slid from the saddle, her legs giving out beneath her. The snow, soft and deceptive, rose around her calves, then her knees. She fell forward, face first, the icy crystals a sharp sting against her burning cheeks. A wave of profound relief, strangely peaceful, washed over her. This was it. The chase was over. The cold would claim her, a gentler end than what Eli Barton surely had in store. She closed her eyes, the wind a lullaby of despair. Then a shadow detached itself from the swirling white. A horse, dark and sturdy, materialized like a specter. Its rider dismounted with an economy of movement, a tall, broad figure against the maelstrom. Lila tried to stir, to scream, but her voice was a rasp, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. Had they found her so soon? Barton's men, fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of exhaustion. A pair of gloved hands, rough but not unkind, rolled her onto her back. She squinted, struggling to focus. Above her, a man's face, etched with lines of hardship and solitude, peered down. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Caution, perhaps, but also a strange, weary compassion. A thick beard, dusted with snow, framed a firm mouth. He wore a worn sheepskin coat, its collar turned up against the elements, and a wide-brimmed hat that offered meager protection. This was no one from Barton's outfit. This was a man of the mountains, of the plains, a man who belonged to the wild. "Girl," his voice was a low rumble, rough like river stones. "You'll freeze out here." He knelt beside her, his movements fluid despite the bulk of his clothing. He didn't touch her beyond the initial turning, his gaze scanning her ruined dress, the raw skin of her hands, the faint bruise darkening her temple. He saw the desperate fear in her eyes, the stark vulnerability of her frozen form. He was Jonas, a name whispered in isolated trading posts and forgotten mining camps. A man who had chosen exile. His cabin, a solitary sentinel in a valley carved by the Yellowstone River, was his sanctuary, his prison. For 2 years, he'd lived with the ghosts of his past for company, the memory of a quick draw, a spilled life, and the blood that had forever stained his hands. He'd killed the foreman's son, a pampered bully, in a fair fight. But a rich man's son's life was worth more than a cowboy's truth in these parts. He'd fled the judgment of men, found his peace in the brutal honesty of the wilderness, and had sworn off human entanglement. But now, a broken woman in a wedding dress lay dying in the snow, and his hardened heart, against his will, stirred. He swung her up, surprisingly gently, onto the back of his own horse, a shaggy, patient cayuse named Old Blue. He then mounted behind her, holding her limp form against his chest, shielding her from the worst of the wind. He left her stolen mare to whatever fate awaited it, a quiet understanding passing between him and the starving animal. There was no time for sentiment, only survival. The ride to his cabin was a blurred agony for Lila, punctuated by the jarring rhythm of the horse's hooves and the deep, steady thrum of Jonas's heart against her back. The cabin appeared suddenly through the blizzard, a low-slung structure of dark logs nestled into a small copse of pines. A thin wisp of smoke curled from its chimney, a beacon of improbable warmth in the desolate night. Jonas dismounted, his movements stiff from the cold, and carefully slid Lila from the horse. She was dead weight in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder. He carried her through the rough-hewn door, the wind screaming its last protest as he slammed it shut. The interior of the cabin was a sudden, blessed reprieve from the fury outside. It was small, a single room dominated by a stone hearth where a meager fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The air, though cold, held the comforting scent of wood smoke, old leather, and something undefinable, something masculine and solitary. Jonas laid her gently on his narrow cot, covered with a threadbare woolen blanket. He didn't light the lamp, preferring the dim, flickering amber glow of the firelight. It softened the edges of the stark room, and perhaps, he thought, it might soften the terror in her eyes when she woke. Lila stirred much later, her eyelids fluttering open like fragile moths. The world swam into view, a blurry landscape of flickering shadows and unfamiliar shapes. The scent of wood smoke was strong, primal, panic, sharp and cold, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. Where was she? Who was this man? She tried to sit up, a gasp escaping her lips as a searing pain shot through her bruised ribs. A hand, large and calloused, appeared in her line of vision, gently pushing her back down. "Easy, now, don't go trying to break yourself further." His voice, the low rumble, she remembered it from the snow. Her eyes, wide and terrified, focused on him. He sat on a stool near the fire, his silhouette framed by the dancing flames. He hadn't moved far from her, a silent sentinel. She swallowed, her throat dry and raw. Who are you?" Her voice was a cracked whisper. "Name's Jonas," he said, his gaze steady, unreadable. "You're in my cabin." She searched his face, trying to find a threat, a hint of malice. There was none, only that same weary compassion, a deep-seated sadness that mirrored her own, but she knew better than to trust. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. The image of Eli Barton, his possessive smirk, flashed in her mind. She had to hide everything. I'm Mary," she lied, the name tumbling out without thought. Mary Beth. It was her mother's name, a safe, distant echo. "My wagon, it overturned. The others, I don't know where they are." Jonas nodded slowly, a faint flicker in his eyes betraying his unspoken understanding of her fabrication. He saw the wedding dress, the blood, the fear in her eyes that went beyond a simple wagon accident. He didn't press. There was a story in her silence, and he knew a thing or two about stories best left untold. He rose from the stool, moving with a quiet grace that belied his rugged appearance. He returned with a small basin of warm water, a clean rag, and a tin of salve. He pulled up another stool beside her cot, careful not to crowd her. "Let's get those cuts tended to," he said, his voice soft, almost a murmur. Lila flinched as he reached for her, her instinct to pull away overwhelming. He paused, his hand hovering, respecting her fear. "I won't hurt you, Marybeth." She watched him warily, her heart hammering against her ribs. Slowly, tentatively, she relaxed a fraction. His touch was light, methodical. He cleaned the cuts on her face and hands with the warm water, his brow furrowed in concentration. His fingers, surprisingly gentle, applied the pungent salve to a gash on her forehead, then carefully bandaged her scraped knuckles. He worked in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind outside. Distrust, thick and heavy, still simmered between them. It was a natural companion in this harsh land, a shield against the unknown. She was a woman alone, vulnerable. He was a man with a past that kept him hidden. Each held their secrets close, a silent pact of unspoken knowledge. As he tended to her, Lila became acutely aware of the rough wool of the blanket against her skin, the ache in her bones, the faint smell of his closeness. She risked a glance at her left hand, still clutched tightly at her side. The gold band, Eli Barton's mark, was still there, hidden beneath her thumb, and around her wrists, beneath the torn lace cuffs of the wedding dress. Angry red bruises bloomed like poisonous flowers. She tried to subtly shift the fabric, to conceal them, but Jonas's eyes, keen and observant, had already registered the movement. He didn't comment, didn't pry, but the silence that followed was heavier, laden with unspoken recognition. The storm outside intensified, a crescendo of wind and pelting snow. It rattled the small window panes, groaned against the sturdy log walls, and whistled down the chimney. It was a force that commanded respect, a wild, untamed thing that had decided to trap them together. The cabin, a small island of flickering light in a sea of white fury, became both a prison and a refuge. Within its confines, the air was a world of dim amber light, painted by the fire's dance, softened by the shadows it cast. The scent of old wood, aged and seasoned, mingled with the colder, fresher air that seeped in through cracks, a constant reminder of the world beyond. Time stretched, elastic and slow, marked only by the dwindling logs on the fire and the rhythmic sigh of the wind. Lila lay on the cot, listening to the storm, to the quiet rustle of Jonas moving about the cabin. He didn't hover, didn't make unnecessary noise. He simply existed, a large, comforting presence in the small space. She watched him stoke the fire, the muscles in his back rippling beneath his shirt. She watched him pour a cup of bitter coffee for himself, steam curling into the dim light. He offered her a mug of weak tea, brewed from some dried herbs, which she accepted with a nod. A heavy silence settled between them, a tangible third presence in the cabin. It wasn't an awkward silence. Not entirely. It was a silence born of necessity, of survival, of two solitary souls thrown together by the cruel hand of fate. It was a silence that held a strange, tender quality, a hesitant offering of sanctuary, but beneath it, a darker current ran, the haunted silence of secrets kept, of pasts that refused to stay buried, of a future utterly uncertain. Lila closed her eyes, clutching the warm mug in her hands. She was alive, for now, and in the heart of the storm, In the presence of this quiet stranger, she felt a fragile, dangerous flicker of hope, a hope that, despite everything, she might just survive. The world outside the cabin dissolved into a uniform, blinding white. The snow fell without pause, a silent, relentless siege that buried the landscape and shrunk their world to the 4 log walls. 3 days passed, then 4. The wind died down, leaving a profound, heavy silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire or the sharp thwack of Jonas's axe biting into pine. They fell into a rhythm born of pure survival. It was a tense, quiet dance of necessity. Each morning, Jonas would rise from his bedroll on the cold floorboards before the first gray light, stir the embers, and pull on his heavy coat. He would vanish into the biting cold for an hour, returning with an armload of firewood, his beard stiff with ice. Lila, awake on the narrow cot, would pretend to be asleep, listening to the solid, reassuring sounds of his return, the stamp of snow from his boots, the clatter of the wood dropped into the box, the soft scrape of the coffee pot being set on the hearth. While he was gone, she would quickly dress, straightening the cot, folding the wool blanket that still held a faint scent of him, soap and wood smoke. Her wedding dress was beyond repair, but she'd found a needle and thread in a small wooden box and had patched the worst of the rips, making it serviceable as a second layer over the plain wool shirt and trousers Jonas had given her. They were his, far too large, but she'd cinched the trousers with a bit of rope, and the warmth was a blessing. Their days were measured in tasks. He would check his snares, returning with a lean rabbit or two, which they would stew with the last of his dried potatoes. He spent an afternoon meticulously cleaning his rifle, the lamplight glinting off the oiled steel. Lila took over the cooking, such as it was. She made a thin, serviceable broth, stretched their meager rations of flour and cornmeal into dense, flat biscuits baked in a skillet over the fire. She mended his clothes, her fingers growing nimble despite the cold. She mended a tear in his sheepskin coat, her stitches small and neat. He'd watched her for a moment, his face impassive, then given a short, single nod of thanks. The silence was the largest thing in the cabin. It filled the corners, hung in the air between them, but it was Jonas's kindness, more than the silence, that unsettled her. It was a kindness devoid of expectation. He never asked her about the lies she'd told. He never asked about the wedding dress, or the bruises on her wrists, which were now fading from angry purple to a sickly yellow-green. He never touched her. When he handed her a mug of coffee, his fingers were careful not to brush hers. When they sat by the fire in the evenings, he kept a deliberate, respectful distance, giving her the warmth of the hearth. He ate his share of the sparse food slowly, never taking more than she did, sometimes pushing the last biscuit toward her. This quiet, undemanding decency was so foreign it felt like a trick. Eli Barton's world was one of transactions. A kindness was a down payment on a future debt, a smile a prelude to a demand. Men, in her experience, were creatures of blunt appetite. Jonas, with his quiet patience and guarded eyes, was a mystery, and it made her ache with a confusion that was almost as painful as her fear. She found herself watching him, trying to understand the man who had saved her but asked for nothing in return. On the 5th night, the storm had finally broken, leaving a landscape of impossible, glittering white under a full moon. The cold was sharper now, the air brittle. They sat by the fire, the stew pot scraped clean, the silence stretched, thinner than usual. Lila stared into the flames, her hands wrapped around her empty mug. "I lied to you," she said, her voice small, barely disturbing the quiet. Jonas didn't look at her. He was sharpening his skinning knife, the shing-shing-shing of the stone against the blade a rhythmic, steady sound. He paused, his hand still. "I figured as much. My name isn't Mary Beth, it's Lila. Lila Monroe." He resumed sharpening, the sound filling the cabin again. "Lila," he repeated, testing the name. He didn't ask for more. But the dam, once cracked, had to give. The words spilled out, soft and halting. "There was no wagon. I was running." She twisted the rope belt at her waist. "From a man, Eli Barton. My father had debts. He owed him his ranch. Everything. Mr. Barton said he would forget the debt if I would marry him." She swallowed, the memory thick and sour in her throat. "I didn't want to. He's an old man and a cruel one. But my father, he made me. The wedding. I ran. I stole a horse and I ran." She stopped, breathing hard, ashamed of the paltry, partial truth. She had not mentioned the ring still hidden in her pocket, nor the bruises, nor the true depths of Barton's cruelty. But it was more truth than she had told anyone in her life. Jonas set the knife and stone down. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, staring into the fire. The light carved deep lines into his face, emphasizing the scar that cut through his left eyebrow. "We all got someone we're running from. Lila," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Sometimes it's a man, sometimes it's a memory." He was quiet for a long time, so long she thought he was done speaking. Then he said, "I ain't supposed to be here, not in this territory, not really anywhere." He picked up a stick and poked at the embers, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "I was a drover, pushing a herd up from Texas. The trail boss had a son, a mean, useless boy with a heavy hand and a taste for hurting things. Animals, mostly, men, when he thought he could get away with it. We were at the Yellowstone. He took his quirt to a new kid, younger than him, for spilling coffee. Just kept at it. The kid was bleeding bad." Jonas's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a man reciting a page from a book he knew by heart. "I told him to stop. He didn't like that. He went for his gun. I was faster." He tossed the stick into the fire. "It was self-defense. Everyone saw it. But his father was a rich man, owned the whole outfit. He called it murder, put a price on my head. I've been hiding ever since." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes clear and cold as the winter sky. "So you see, you ain't the only one in this cabin afraid of a knock on the door." A new understanding settled between them. Heavy as the snow outside, they were fugitives. He from the law, she from the man who owned it. The air in the cabin shifted, the silence no longer empty but filled with their shared secrets, their shared, low-thrumming fear. They both carried the weight of what they'd done, and the heavier weight of what might be done to them. The guilt was different, his for a life taken, hers for a life stolen, but it branded them just the same, outcasts. The next day, the sun was a weak disk in a pale sky. Jonas announced he was going to clear the heavy snow from the roof. "It's too much weight, could bust a beam." Lila watched him from the doorway, wrapped in the wool blanket. He moved with a steady, practiced strength. He'd fashioned a long pole with a flat board at the end and climbing onto the lower lean-to of the woodshed. He began to push the great drifts of snow off the main cabin roof. It was brutal, heavy work. His muscles strained against his worn shirt, his breath pluming in great white clouds. He was solid, competent, a man who knew how to survive, how to fix what was broken. She watched his movements, the easy power in his shoulders, the sure-footed way he balanced on the slick logs. A strange, unfamiliar feeling crept into her chest. It wasn't just gratitude, and it was sharper than fear. It was a deep, physical ache, a longing that had nothing to do with her escape and everything to do with the man. She'd been currency, a piece of property to be bartered. She'd been terrified of a man's touch, of a man's mere presence. But watching Jonas, strong and solitary, fixing the roof of the small prison that had become her sanctuary, she felt a different kind of longing. It was a yearning for the safety he represented, a safety that was fast becoming tangled with the man himself. Her fear of men had been a cold, hard thing. This new ache was warm, and it frightened her even more. That night, the tension in the cabin was a living thing. It was in the way their eyes met for a fraction of a second too long, the way they were both careful to keep their hands to themselves. The stilted, sparse words they exchanged about the weather, the woodpile, the dwindling food. After their meager supper of rabbit stew, Jonas sat on his stool, mending a piece of tack. His head bent over his work. Lila felt restless, her skin crawling. She was dirty. She hadn't been truly clean since she'd fled Barton's ranch. The memory of his hands on her, his breath, made her feel soiled, as if the grime was a part of him she couldn't escape. There was half a kettle of water warm by the fire. On impulse, she grabbed the basin, the bar of harsh lye soap, and a clean rag. She poured the water into the basin, the steam rising in the cold air. She glanced at Jonas. He was still focused on his work, the needle and all moving in his large, calloused hands. She hesitated, then pulled her stool closer to the fire, turning her back to him slightly, affording herself a small illusion of privacy. She unbraided her hair, the long, dark strands tumbling over her shoulders. She dipped the rag in the water, lathered the soap, and began to wash. She scrubbed at her scalp, her arms, her neck, trying to wash away the memory of Barton, the grit of the ride, the smell of fear. The cabin was filled with the clean, sharp scent of the lye. She leaned over the basin, rinsing her hair, the water turning gray. Jonas had stopped working. He tried not to look. It was a private thing. He told himself to look away, to go outside, to give her that, but he couldn't. He watched the firelight catch the wet strands of her hair, turning them from dark brown to gleaming copper. He watched the curve of her neck as she leaned over, the pale, vulnerable skin. He saw the line of her shoulder blades through the thin wool shirt. She was not the half-frozen creature he'd pulled from the snow. She was a woman, young and alive, and beautiful in her desperation. He saw her fragility, but now he also saw her strength, a deep, profound loneliness, an ache he had kept buried for years, rose in him, fierce and sudden. It was a hunger for warmth, for connection, for something other than the ghosts and the cold. His hands, gripping the leather strap, tightened until his knuckles were white. Lila finished, wringing the water from her hair. She wrapped it in the rag and turned to face the fire, her back straight. She could feel his eyes on her. The air in the cabin was so thick she could barely breathe. The silence was no longer heavy. It was sharp, brittle, like ice about to crack. She ran her fingers through her damp hair, trembling slightly, though not from the cold. She was balanced on the edge of something terrifying and unknown. She looked at him, his face half in shadow, his eyes fixed on her, dark and unreadable. Her own daring shocked her. The words came out in a whisper, so soft she wasn't sure she'd even spoken them. "Do you ever miss being touched?" The question hung in the air, raw and exposed. Jonas flinched, as if she had struck him. His face hardened, the mask of the solitary man slamming back into place. The desire in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by something cold, something almost like anger or fear. He had not been touched, not in kindness, not in years. The question cut straight to the core of his exile, to the raw, festering wound of his loneliness. To answer it was to admit a need, and need, in his world, was a fatal weakness. He said nothing. He threw the piece of tack onto the floor, stood abruptly, and grabbed his heavy coat from the peg by the door. He didn't look at her. He pulled the door open, letting in a blast of frigid night air that made the candle flicker wildly. Then he was gone, slamming the door shut behind him, leaving Lila alone in the sudden, echoing silence. She stayed by the dying fire, the rag still wrapped around her head. She was trembling, a deep, shuddering tremor that started in her belly and spread to her limbs. She had misread everything. She had mistaken his kindness for something else, his loneliness for her own. She had offered a fragile piece of her new self, and he had rejected it. broken it. She had pushed too hard, dared too much. She had survived Eli Barton, survived the blizzard, only to be undone by a single, whispered question. The fire settled, the logs collapsing into glowing embers, and Lila Monroe, fugitive and survivor, felt utterly, hopelessly alone. Jonas did not return that night. Lila lay on the cot, wrapped in the blanket, listening to the cabin timbers groan and settle as the great weight of the snow pressed down. The fire burned to embers, and the cold, a sharp, invasive presence, crept back into the room. She was alone with the echo of her own question, a raw, exposed thing. She felt a shame so profound it burned hot in her chest, hotter than the lye soap on her skin. She had misread him. His kindness was just that, the decent, distant pity of a man for a stray animal. She had tried to make it more. She had tried to pull him into her own desperate need, and he had fled. When the first thin gray light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the shuttered window, the door opened. Jonas entered, a gust of frigid air swirling in with him. He was covered in a fine dusting of snow, his face grim and pale with cold. He did not look at her. He moved stiffly to the hearth, his back to her, and began to build up the fire with practiced, rough movements. The silence was brittle, filled with the things they had not said. "You should not have stayed out," she whispered to his back. "You'll catch your death." "I've slept in worse," he said, his voice flat. He hunkered down, blowing on the new kindling, coaxing a small flame to life. Lila sat up, swinging her legs off the cot. The floorboards were like ice against her bare feet. The tension from the night before was still a live wire between them. But something else was new. The wind had stopped. The oppressive, howling prison of the storm had ended. Jonas seemed to feel it, too. Once the fire was steady, he stood and crossed to the door. He unbarred it, pulling it open just a crack, his body blocking the opening. He squinted against the sudden, blinding glare of sunlight on snow. The world was remade, a vast, unbroken sheet of white under a sharp blue sky. It was beautiful, and it was terrible. "It's over," Lila said, moving to stand near him, craving the light. "The storm," he corrected, his voice low. He scanned the horizon, his eyes moving slowly, methodically, from the ridge line to the flat expanse of the valley. But not the trouble. He was quiet for a full minute, his body rigid. Then he let out a slow breath, a faint plume of white. "Riders," he said. Lila's heart stopped, then hammered against her ribs. "Where?" "Miles off, to the east, where the valley opens up. 4 of them." He stepped back, letting her see. She peered past his shoulder. At first, she saw nothing but the blinding white. Then he pointed. "There, by that stand of cottonwoods." She saw them, 4 black specks, like ants on a linen sheet, moving slowly, picking their way through the deep drifts. They were impossibly far, yet they felt as close as the cold on her skin. "It's him," she breathed, tasting ash. "It's Barton's men." Jonas shut the door, the latch clicking with a dreadful finality. The dim, firelit cabin felt safe for a second, then horribly small. A trap. "They're moving slow," he said, his voice all business now. The awkwardness of the night burned away by a new, shared danger. "The snow is deep. They won't be here before midday, maybe later, but they're coming this way." He turned to her, his eyes clear and hard. "You need to leave, now." "Leave? Leave where?" "My horse is strong, Old Blue. He can handle the drifts if you follow the ridge north. There are mining camps in the bitter roots. You can lose yourself there. Get a job cooking, laundry. They don't ask questions in those camps." "And you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They aren't looking for me. They're looking for a woman in a wedding dress. If they find you here, with me." He let the thought hang. A runaway bride found with a man branded a murderer. They won't ask questions. Lila, they'll shoot me and drag you back to him. You're safer without me. I'm safer without you. His words were practical, logical, and they felt like a betrayal. He was casting her out, back into the white, back into the world that had tried to swallow her. He was already moving, stuffing a canvas sack with a block of jerky, a handful of dried biscuits, and his spare blanket. You'll have to ride hard. Don't stop. He pushed the sack toward her. She didn't take it. No, she said. He stopped, frustrated. No, girl, this ain't a discussion. Those men are coming to skin you alive, and me, along with you. You have to go. And what if I find more men like them? She shot back, her fear turning to a sudden, hot anger. What if I find another man who wants to save me and then decides I'm too much trouble? What if I freeze out there, or starve, or a wolf finds me? You think that's safer? It's a better chance than you've got waiting here. No, her voice cracked. Safer. You keep using that word. There is no safer. Not for me. I ran from my father's house, and he's sold me. I ran from my husband's house, and he's hunting me. I ran into the storm, and I almost died. Now you want me to run into the snow, alone, because I'm a burden to you. She was shaking, her hands clenched at her sides. I don't trust the world out there. Jonas, I don't trust the snow, or the mountains, or the next man I meet in some mining camp. I'm staying. I'd rather face them here, with a gun, than die alone in a snowdrift. He stared at her, stunned by the ferocity in her voice. He saw it then. She wasn't just being stubborn. She was broken. The world had broken her trust in everything, including the simple act of survival. The cabin, this small, dark box, was the only place she had felt a moment's peace in a week. He was asking her to abandon it. You're a fool, then, he said, but the bite was gone from his voice. Then I'm a fool, she whispered. But I am not running again. The stalemate settled, as heavy and cold as the snow outside. The day dragged on, an eternity of shared dread. Jonas gave up arguing. He went outside and brought Old Blue into the small, lean-to stable attached to the cabin, where he kept his winter wood. He wouldn't risk the horse being seen. He spent the next hours preparing. He barred the door. He took the single wooden shutter from its peg and nailed it over the small window, plunging the cabin into a near-total darkness, lit only by the low fire and a single, flickering candle he lit on the table. He checked his rifle, then his pistol, laying out the cartridges in neat rows. Lila sat on the cot, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She watched him move, his actions economical and deadly. He was preparing for a fight he knew he couldn't win. 4 men against 1, and for what? For her. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. Dusk came. The riders had not. Maybe they missed us, she said, her voice dry. The snow. Maybe it covered the chimney smoke. Maybe. Jonas said. He was standing by the door, listening. Or maybe they made camp, waiting for morning. The night deepened. The cabin was utterly silent. The waiting was worse than the chase. It was a slow strangulation. Jonas, she said into the darkness. He grunted, his attention still on the door. You need to know, she said, the words spilling out, desperate. You need to know what he is, why I can't go back. He turned then, his silhouette a dark, broad shape against the faint firelight. He walked to the stool and sat, his rifle resting across his knees. Go on. She told him everything, not the clipped, shame-filled version from before, but the full, ugly truth. My father didn't just have debts, she began, her voice a low monotone. He's a weak man. He gambles. He lost the ranch to Barton in a card game, but he begged. Barton is a collector. He likes owning things, people. He looked at me, And he laughed. He told my father he could keep a small parcel, if he gave me as part of the bargain. My father, he agreed. He told me it was my duty. She paused, remembering the dead look in her father's eyes. The wedding was a week later. The night before, I couldn't sleep. The house was full of his men. Drinking, I felt soiled. I went to the stables. I just wanted to be with the horses. It was the only place that felt clean. Her breath hitched. He was there, Barton, in the stable yard, with one of the hands. A young man. Thomas. He was a good man. He had tried to be kind to me. Jonas's jaw tightened. He said nothing, just watched her, his face a mask of shadows. They were arguing. Thomas was accusing him, said Barton had sold his sister into a bad house in Miles City, said he was a monster, and Barton, he just smiled. Thomas was crying. He was so angry. He called Barton a devil, and he spat at him. Lila was trembling, reliving it. Barton, he didn't even wipe his face. He pulled his pistol, a little one, from his pocket, and he shot Thomas. Just shot him. In the chest. Thomas, he just looked surprised. Then he fell. Barton watched him for a moment. Then he nudged him with his boot. He told his foreman, who came running, that the boy had tried to steal his horse, that it was an accident. And you? Jonas's voice was rough. I was in the shadows, in the hayloft. He looked up. I don't know if he saw me. I think he did. I think he knew I was there. I ran back to the house. The next day, he married me. And that night, when he came to my room... She stopped. She couldn't say it. He wasn't just claiming his wife, she whispered, the tears finally coming, hot and silent. He was branding me, showing me I was his, that what I saw didn't matter, that I didn't matter. He told me. He said, a wife sees nothing. A wife says nothing. You are mine now. She looked at Jonas, her face streaked with tears in the candlelight. He's not hunting a runaway bride. Jonas, he's hunting a witness. He will never, ever stop. And he will kill anyone who stands in his way. He'll kill you just for giving me shelter. Jonas sat frozen, the rifle heavy on his lap. He had killed a man. The guilt of it, the weight of a life taken, lived in his bones. But what he had done was a moment of fire and blood, a desperate act of self-defense. This was cold. This was the casual cruelty of a snake. This was an evil he hadn't let himself believe in for a long time. The law was hunting him for being faster than a bully. The law was protecting Barton. Lila's story broke something in him. His own isolation, his own guilt, seemed small, almost selfish, next to the abyss she had faced. She was crying openly now, but quietly, a deep, hopeless, racking sob of pure shame. I'm sorry, she wept. I've doomed you. I should have just laid down in the snow. Jonas put the rifle down. He moved from the stool, not to the cot, but to the floor beside it. He knelt, his knees cracking on the cold boards. He was not towering over her. He was beside her. He didn't offer comfort, not with words. He didn't say it would be all right. He just knelt, sharing the cold, the darkness, the terror. He offered his presence as a shield. Her hand, trembling so hard she could barely control it, lifted from her lap. She didn't know why she did it. She reached out and touched the scar on his brow, the raised line of flesh that marked him. It was a map of his own pain. Her fingers traced it, a feather-light touch. His breath caught. It had been so long. His hand, calloused and scarred from rope and weather, rose. He moved with infinite slowness, as if approaching a spooked horse. He didn't grab her. He didn't pull her close. He simply laid his thumb against her cheek, catching a tear. He brushed it away, his touch rough but unbelievably gentle. It was the first touch, wordless, A bridge built across the darkness. The candle flame guttered, casting long shadows. The air was thick with their shared breath, the smell of wood smoke and her tears. She looked at him, her eyes wide, questioning. He looked back, his own gaze stripped bare of its defenses, showing the profound, aching loneliness he had fled from. Slowly, her hands shaking, Lila stood. Jonas remained kneeling, watching her. She stood by the fire, bathed in its low, amber light. She was not looking at him with invitation or with guile. Her eyes were full of a terrible, stark vulnerability. She was giving him the last thing she had left to give, her trust. With trembling fingers, she untied the rope at her waist. The oversized wool trousers, his trousers, fell in a heap around her ankles. She stood in the long shirt and her thin, tattered chemise. Jonas watched, his heart hammering. He felt a wave of something so powerful it was almost painful, a mix of fierce, protective reverence and a deep, starved desire. He understood what she was doing. This was not seduction. This was a plea. This was her standing in the wreck of her life, showing him all her broken pieces. This was surrender. Not to him, but to the moment. A way of being seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first and last time. Her hands went to the buttons of the wool shirt, one by one. She undid them. Her fingers fumbled. She pushed the heavy shirt off her shoulders, letting it fall. She stood before him in the thin, torn cotton of her chemise. The firelight was kind, but it did not hide the faint, fading yellow of the bruises on her wrists, the shadow of another on her ribs. She was trembling, from the cold, from the fear, from the sheer, terrifying audacity of the act. Jonas slowly rose to his feet. He still did not move toward her. Lila looked at him, her eyes begging him to understand. Her hands, pale and shaking in the dim light, lifted slightly from her sides, palms half turned toward him. They were not reaching. They were simply open, an offering, a question. Please. He crossed the small space between them in one stride. He stopped an inch from her, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her skin. He didn't touch her body. He raised his hands, slow and tender, and cupped her face. His rough palms framed her jaw, his thumbs tracing the damp path of her tears. Lila, he whispered. It was the only word he had. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of hunger. It was hesitant, searching, a question of his own. It tasted of salt and wood smoke and shared despair. She didn't kiss him back at first. She simply received it, a small, shuddering sigh escaping her. Then, her own hands came up, not to beg, but to hold. They gripped the front of his shirt, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. He deepened the kiss, and it was filled with all the pain and loneliness of their two broken lives. It was a drowning man's first breath. He slid one arm around her waist, pulling her against him, and lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her the 2 steps to the narrow cot and laid her down, following her, covering her body with his. He kept his weight on his elbows, careful not to crush her. He looked down at her, his face a mask of pained desire. This was not lust. Lust was a simple, selfish thing. This was a rebellion. It was a desperate, human act against the cold, against the cruelty of men like Barton, against the judgment of a world that had branded them both as outcasts. It was 2 people, trapped in the dark, deciding to make a small, warm light, even if it was only for one night. When he moved, it was slow, hesitant. It was a joining that felt more like a mending, a careful piecing together of 2 shattered souls. It was tenderness carved from the heart of violence, a brief, defiant stand against the loneliness that waited just outside the door. Lila woke to the sound of her own heart. The cabin was thick with a pre-dawn cold that was sharper than any blade. It was a dead, hollow cold, the kind that came after a fire had died to its last ember. She lay perfectly still on the narrow cot, the rough blanket pulled to her chin. Across the small room, a dark shape on the floorboards. Jonas slept, wrapped in his bedroll. He was turned away from her, his breathing slow and deep. The events of the night rushed back, not as a memory of warmth, but as a hot, searing guilt. The riders, her confession, the candlelight, the desperate, silent union. What had she done? She looked at the man on the floor. He was an outcast, a man hiding from the world, a man who had survived on his own terms. He had found a fragile peace in his isolation, and she had shattered it. She was a storm, just like the one that had thrown her at his door. She was Barton's property, a marked woman, and by touching her, by sheltering her, Jonas had painted a target on his own back. She hadn't just brought her trouble to his door, she had pulled him down into it. She had ruined him. The shame was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. She couldn't stay. She couldn't be the reason those men, Barton's men, brutal and remorseless, rode down on this cabin and killed the only person who had shown her a moment's true kindness. Moving with infinite care, she slipped from the cot. The floorboards were like ice, biting at the soles of her feet. She held her breath, listening to the steady rhythm of his sleep. He didn't stir. In the near-total darkness, she found his clothes he had given her, pulling them on over her thin chemise. Her hands shook, fumbling with the buttons. She pulled on her mended wedding dress over that, a ghostly, tattered armor. Her boots. She grabbed the small canvas sack he had packed for her yesterday, the one meant for her escape. It felt heavy in her hand, a final, bitter charity. She didn't dare look at him. If she looked, she would stay. She reached for the door, lifting the heavy wooden bar with excruciating slowness, wincing at the faint scrape of wood on wood. She slipped through the opening and into the blue-gray twilight. The cold was a slap. It stole her breath. The world was a vast, silent expanse of white, the snow glowing under a sky just beginning to pale in the east. Frost, sharp and crystalline, instantly began to gather in her hair and on the torn lace at her collar. She took one step, then another. The snow crunched, the sound echoing, impossibly loud in the stillness. She was leaving. It was the only way to save him. "You won't last an hour." His voice, low and rough with sleep, cut through the silence. She froze, her back to him. She couldn't turn, couldn't face the accusation in his eyes. "I have to," she whispered, her voice trembling, the words snatched by the wind. "They'll kill you, because of me. I've ruined you." She heard him step out onto the snow, the crunch closer now. He wasn't wearing his coat, just his shirt and trousers. "Lila!" She squeezed her eyes shut. "Please, Jonas, let me go. It's better this way. He'll find me, but he won't find you." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the pines. She waited for the anger, the relief, the final dismissal. "I was ruined long before you got here," he said, his voice flat, a statement of simple, unadorned fact. "Just not by you." She turned, slowly. He stood 6 feet away, his arms crossed over his chest, his face etched with a profound, weary sadness. The cold was making him shiver, but he seemed not to notice. He was looking at her, not with anger, but with a raw, unguarded honesty that mirrored her own from the night before. He wasn't ruined by her, he was just ruined. Like her. The distinction broke her. The tears she'd held back now came, freezing as they tracked down her cheeks. "What do we do?" she breathed, the question a plea. He looked past her, toward the east, where the sky was now a pale, cold pink. The riders hadn't come. The deep snow had slowed them, or they had lost the trail. Or they were camped, waiting. It didn't matter. They were out there. "We run," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Together." He turned and went back inside, leaving her to follow. They moved with a new, shared urgency. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. They had one horse, his sturdy cayuse, Old Blue. It meant the journey would be agonizingly slow. "We ride and tie," he explained, his voice all business as he packed. He tossed her the canvas sack. "Put what's left of the food in there. And the cartridges." He gathered his rifle, his pistol, the bedroll, the blanket from the cot, and his skinning knife. He worked with a grim efficiency. Lila, her hands clumsy, packed the last of the biscuits and jerky. She looked at the cabin, this small, dark box that had saved her, and felt a pang of loss. "Where?" she asked, tying the sack shut. "Bitterroot Mountains," he said, slinging the bedroll over his shoulder. "West, there's mining towns, gold camps, silver camps, places a man can dig a hole and the world forgets his name, places a woman can—" He paused, then just said, "They're new. They don't have long memories." He saddled Old Blue in the lean-to, the horse snorting, its breath pluming in the cold. Jonas led the horse out. He checked the horizon one last time. Nothing but white. He tied the bedroll and the sack behind the saddle. He looked at her. "You ride first." He helped her up, his hands firm on her waist. She settled into the worn leather, the rifle resting across her lap. Jonas took the horse's lead rope. "We follow the creek bed. It'll give us cover, and it's harder to track a horse in broken ice than in open snow." He began to walk, leading the horse into the frozen landscape, and Lila, mounted high, looked back one last time at the small cabin, a plume of smoke still rising from its chimney, a false beacon of a life that was already gone. The land was merciless. For 3 days, they walked and rode, trading places every hour. When one rode, the other walked behind, holding onto the saddle horn to be pulled through the deeper drifts. The cold was a constant, gnawing presence. They crossed icy creeks that shattered under the horses' weight, plunging them into knee-deep, frigid water that froze their trousers and boots into stiff, painful shells. At night, they made cold camps, digging a pit in the snow down to the frozen earth, building a small, smokeless fire of dry aspen wood that offered little warmth and much danger. They huddled together under the single blanket and his bedroll, a purely practical act of survival that was more intimate than anything that had passed between them in the cabin. In the shared misery, they began to talk. The words came in fragments, small offerings against the vast silence. "My PA," Jonas said one night, staring into the tiny fire. "He was a hatter, in St. Louis. Hated it. Used to tell me the beaver was the only honest creature God made. Guess that's why I came west." Lila, her hands tucked into her armpits for warmth, whispered, "My mother loved yellow roses. We had a trellis before my father lost his sense. She died when I was 10. I think he died with her. The man who sold me, that was just a ghost." They shared their scars. He showed her the puckered white mark on his thigh, from a Comanche arrow 20 years gone. She showed him the small, crescent-shaped scar on her palm, from when her father, in a drunken anger, had knocked a hot oil lamp from her hand. They shared their fears. He worried about the horse going lame. She worried about the sound of the wind, imagining it was the cry of riders. They saw wolf tracks, a line of single, purposeful paw prints in the snow, a grim reminder that they were not the only hunters. They were hungry, they were cold, they were exhausted, but they were together. One evening, they stopped in a sheltered grove of pines. The snow was thinner here, the wind softer. Jonas pulled the rifle from its scabbard. "You need to know how to use this," he said. He handed it to her. The weight of it surprised her. A solid, cold heaviness. It felt wrong in her hands. A tool of violence. The same kind of tool Barton had used to end Thomas's life. Her hands shook. "I can't," she said, trying to give it back. "You will," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. He stood behind her, his presence a solid wall. He didn't touch her. Not yet. It ain't about wanting to. It's about needing to. The world doesn't care if your hands are clean, Lila. It only cares if you're quick. He showed her how to load the cartridge, how to work the lever, how to sight down the long, blue steel barrel. There, that pine cone, on the stump. She lifted the rifle. It was heavy, unwieldy. Her arms trembled. "Breathe out," he said, his voice low by her ear. "Breathe all the way out. And when your lungs are empty, that's when you're steadiest. Don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it, slow, like you're squeezing water from a rag." His hand covered hers, just for a second. Positioning her finger correctly, his touch was practical, steadying. She breathed in, she breathed out. The world went still. She squeezed. The explosion was deafening. The rifle stock slammed into her shoulder. A brutal, jarring punch that knocked the breath from her and sent a jolt of pain through her collarbone. She staggered back, Jonas catching her elbow. The pine cone was untouched. "Again," he said. She loaded it herself this time, her shoulder throbbing. She lifted it, settled the stock against the new bruise. She breathed. She squeezed. The shot cracked, and a puff of bark exploded from the stump, just inches from the cone. "Closer," he said, a hint of approval in his voice. She loaded, she aimed. This time, she wasn't just afraid, she was angry. Angry at Barton, at her father, at the cold, at the shaking in her own hands. She squeezed. The pine cone vanished in a tiny explosion of wood and snow. She lowered the rifle, her shoulder screaming, her ears ringing. A small, fierce smile touched her lips. Jonas nodded once. "You learned fast." That night, huddled by the fire, the lesson lingered between them. She was rubbing her shoulder, the pain a dull, warm throb. The shared act, the trust he'd shown her, had shifted something. She looked at the flames, her face soft in the orange light. "When I was a girl," she said, her voice quiet. "Before my mother died, I used to dream about what my life would be. It wasn't anything grand. I thought I'd meet a farmer or a blacksmith, someone quiet, and I'd choose him." She looked up at Jonas, his face half in shadow. "And he'd be kind, and we'd have a small house with yellow roses." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "It sounds so simple, doesn't it? Just to choose." Jonas looked at her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. He understood the profound weight of that simple word. He, a man defined by a single, deadly choice he'd been forced to make. She, a woman who had never been given one. He said nothing, but his gaze was a promise. After 2 weeks, they were starving. The jerky was gone, the biscuits a memory. They were in the foothills, the great snow-capped wall of the bitterroots looming before them. They came upon a trading post, a low-slung sod building dug into the side of a riverbank, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. "We need food," Jonas said, "and salt, and cartridges." "It's a risk," Lila whispered. "It's a bigger risk to starve," he said. He took the last of his coins from his pocket. It wasn't much. "I'll go. You wait with Old Blue, in those trees." He pointed to a thick stand of aspens 100 yards away. "If you hear anything, you ride. Don't wait for me. You ride west as hard as you can." "Jonas, no." "Do as I say, Lila." His voice was hard, leaving no room for argument. She watched him walk across the frozen clearing, his shoulders set, his hand near the pistol at his hip. He looked small against the vast, empty landscape. He disappeared inside the sod structure. Lila waited, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Every second stretched for an hour. The wind soughed through the bare aspen branches. Then a shout. It was not Jonas. It was a rough, triumphant roar. "Jonas! Jonas Kerrigan! By God, it is you! I knew that face!" Lila's blood turned to ice. The door of the trading post burst open. Jonas ran out, a small sack of flour clutched in his left hand. He was scrambling, his boots slipping on the icy path. Behind him, a large, grizzled man in a heavy buffalo coat appeared, leveling a long-barreled pistol. His face was a mask of greedy triumph. "That's $500. Kerrigan, dead or alive." The man fired. The crack of the pistol echoed across the river valley. Jonas cried out, a sharp grunt of pain, and stumbled. He grabbed his left arm, but he didn't fall. He kept running, adrenaline and desperation fueling his legs. "Ride, Lila, ride," he bellowed. She didn't ride. She kicked Old Blue forward, out of the trees, galloping toward him. The bounty hunter was fumbling, trying to reload his single-shot pistol. Jonas reached the horse, grabbed the saddle horn with his good hand, and hauled himself up behind the cantle, his face pale and slick with sweat. Another man, the trader, appeared in the doorway with a rifle. "Go!" Jonas roared, kicking the horse's flanks. Old Blue lunged forward, scrambling up the riverbank and into the thick woods. A rifle shot splintered a branch just above Lila's head. They plunged into the forest, not following a trail, just running, the branches whipping their faces, the horses' panicked breaths loud in the sudden, deep quiet of the trees. They rode for miles, pushing the horse until its sides were heaving and lathered. Finally, in a deep ravine choked with snow and fallen trees, Jonas slid from the horse's back, falling to his knees. Lila was off in an instant. Beside him, his entire left sleeve, from shoulder to elbow, was dark and wet with blood. "He just grazed me," Jonas panted, leaning his head back against a poplar tree, his eyes squeezed shut in pain. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. The girl who had trembled at the sight of a rifle was gone. This was her man, and he was hurt. "Sit," she commanded, her voice steady. She pulled his knife from its sheath. "This is going to hurt." She slit the heavy fabric of his coat and shirt, from cuff to shoulder, peeling the wet, sticky cloth away from the wound. It wasn't a graze. The bullet had torn a long, shallow furrow through the muscle of his upper arm, a raw, red valley of torn flesh that was bleeding heavily. He hissed, his breath catching. Lila unslung their canteen. She ripped a long, clean strip from the hem of her chemise, the second one she had sacrificed. She poured the icy water directly into the wound, washing away the blood and bits of wool. Jonas went rigid. A low groan forced from his throat, but he didn't pull away. She worked quickly, her hands sure. She packed the wound with the cleanest snow she could find, pressing down hard to staunch the bleeding, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. Then she bound the arm tightly with a strip of cloth, her knots firm and practical. He was watching her, his face pale, his eyes dark with pain and something else, awe. She finished, her hands stained red. She looked up and met his gaze, her own fierce and unwavering. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice thick. "Back in the snow. You saved me from freezing. You saved me from them." She leaned in, pressing her forehead against his, her damp hair mixing with his. "Let me save you now." He reached up with his good hand, not to touch his wound, but to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. He held her there, breathing, just breathing. The bond, forged in a blizzard and sealed in candlelight, had now been tempered in blood and gunpowder. It was no longer just a shared escape. It was a fragile, desperate, and terrifying thing. It was belonging. The snow did not melt. It retreated. It pulled back slowly from the foothills, surrendering the south-facing slopes first, revealing a world of mud, matted grass, and the sharp, green promise of skunk cabbage. The creeks, locked in ice for months, broke free with a roar, turning the lowlands into a brown, churning soup. Winter was not over, but its spine was broken. They followed the thaw, moving west, always west, until the jagged blue-white peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains were no longer a distant promise but a wall that filled the sky. At the mouth of a narrow canyon, where a frothing creek emptied onto the plain, they found a town. It was not much, a cluster of raw pine buildings, a muddy main street churned by wagon wheels, a sawmill, and 3 saloons. It was called Pine Creek. It was a town built on hope and desperation, populated by miners, prospectors, loggers, and the merchants who fed on them. It was a place with no past, only a brutal, demanding present. It was perfect. They rented a 1-room cabin at the far edge of town, barely more than a shed. It's back to the wilderness. Jonas sold Old Blue and their gear for a small pile of coin. It was enough to buy a new axe, 2 blankets, a skillet, and a month's worth of flour and beans. He told the man at the mercantile his name was Jonas Cole. Lila, standing beside him, her hair tied back, her face pale and thin, was just his wife. A new, quiet life began. Jonas, his arm now a map of scarred, tight flesh, found work with a logging crew. He left before dawn, his axe on his shoulder, and returned after dusk, smelling of pine and sweat, his body aching with a good, honest exhaustion. He was a woodcutter. He was Jonas Cole. The name felt strange, but the work was real. Lila made their small cabin a home. She scrubbed the floors, patched the chinking with mud and straw, and bought cheap calico with the few coins she earned from sewing. She mended shirts for the miners, her fingers, once raw from the cold, now calloused from the needle. She kept to herself. She went to the general store for supplies, her eyes down, her answers to the shopkeeper's idle questions short and polite. For a while, it was quiet. The spring deepened. Wildflowers bloomed on the hillsides. They lived in a fragile truce with the world. In the evenings, they would sit by their small stove, Jonas cleaning his new, cheap pistol, Lila sewing. They didn't talk much, but the silence was different now. It was not the haunted, wary silence of the mountain cabin. It was a shared, comfortable quiet. Sometimes, he would reach out, his hand rough from the axe, and just rest it on her shoulder, and she would lean into his touch. They were, in these small moments, almost happy. Then, in late May, a rider came. He was not a local. He rode a fine, lathered horse, a horse from the rich valleys to the east. He wore a good coat and a flat-brimmed hat. He stopped at the sheriff's office, a small clapboard building in the center of town. Lila was across the street, at the mercantile, picking out thread. She watched through the window as the man tacked a piece of paper to the board outside the office. Her blood went cold. She paid for her thread, her hands suddenly clumsy, and walked back into the muddy street. She made herself walk slowly. She did not look at the poster. She went back to her cabin, but she knew. The certainty was a sickness in her stomach. An hour later, she forced herself to return. She needed to see. The street was empty, the town in the grip of its midday work. She stood before the board. Wanted. Reward, $100. It was her name, Lila Monroe. There was a crude drawing, a sketch that looked nothing and everything like her. It described her hair, her eyes, her height. It said she was a runaway. It said she had stolen a horse and articles of value from her husband, Eli Barton. It called her an absconder, a thief. She stood there, reading the words, the mud of Pine Creek sucking at the heels of her worn boots. The sun felt warm on her back, but she was freezing, the same bone-deep cold she'd felt in the blizzard. He had found her, or rather, he had cast a net, and she had swum into it. The whispers started that afternoon. Mrs. Gable, the mercantile owner's wife, who had been friendly just that morning, suddenly found herself too busy to speak, turning her back when Lila entered. 2 miners, lounging on the saloon porch, stopped talking as she passed, their eyes following her, bold and assessing. She heard a word, half-whispered. Barton's. When Jonas came home that night, he knew before she said a word. He saw it in the way she stood by the cold stove, her hands clasped, her face white and still. "He found us," she said. It wasn't a question. "I saw it," he said, dropping his axe by the door. "The men, they were talking. At the mill." "What are we going to do?" He crossed to her, his face grim. "We pack. What little we have, we leave tonight. We go farther west, California, Oregon, somewhere he can't reach." Lila looked at him. She looked at the small room she had scrubbed, the curtains she had sewn, the worn, clean blanket on their bed. It was not much. It was everything. "No," she said, her voice quiet, but hard as river stone. Jonas stopped. "Lila, this ain't a discussion. That poster brands you a thief. It won't be long before someone, that bounty hunter, connects my face to Jonas Kerrigan. We're trapped. We have to run." "I am done running," she said, and she met his gaze. The woman who had trembled at the sound of his voice in the snow was gone. In her place was a woman who had learned to shoot, who had dressed his wound, who had buried her past so many times she was tired of digging graves. "I ran from my father's house," she said, her voice low and steady. "I ran from Eli Barton. I almost ran from your cabin. We ran from those men at the trading post. All we do is run, and every time, the world gets smaller. What's west of here? Jonas, another town, another cabin, another poster? When do we stop?" "We stop when we're safe," he argued, his frustration rising. "We will never be safe," she countered, her voice rising to match his. "Not as long as he's alive. Don't you see? He'll never stop. He's not looking for a wife. He's not looking for a horse. He's looking for the girl who saw him murder a man. He's tying up a loose end, and I will not let him chase me into the ocean." "So what?" Jonas threw his hands up. "We stay? We wait for him? Or for the sheriff to come knocking?" "I'm going to the sheriff." Jonas stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "You're what?" "Lila. The law's for men like Barton. It's not for us. They'll lock you up and send you back to him. And they'll hang me." "Maybe," she said, pulling her thin shawl around her shoulders. "But I'm not going to hide. I'm not a thief. And I'm not a liar. Not anymore." She walked past him, out the door. He cursed, grabbed his pistol, and followed her, his long strides catching up to her on the main street. He didn't try to stop her. He just walked beside her, his hand on the butt of his gun, his face a mask of anger and fear. The town was alive with the evening. Men streamed from the saloons, their voices loud. Women called their children in from the street, and every single person stopped to stare at them. At the woodcutter and the woman from the poster, the whispers were louder now, naked and cruel. "A murderer and a fallen bride," a woman in a sunbonnet hissed to her friend, pulling her skirts aside as if Lila were diseased. Jonas flinched, but Lila kept walking, her head high, her eyes fixed on the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was an older man, with a tobacco-stained mustache and weary eyes. He looked up from his paperwork when they entered, his gaze lingering on Jonas's hand, which was still on his pistol. "Cole," the sheriff said, his voice wary. "Ma'am." "Sheriff," Lila said, her voice clear in the small, quiet room. "You have a poster on your board, for me." The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "I saw it. Says you ran from your husband. Eli Barton. That's a powerful name. Mrs. Barton." "My name is Lila Monroe," she said. "And I did not run. I escaped." Jonas stood by the door, his body blocking the exit. A silent, deadly guardian. Lila told her story. She started with her father's debt. She spoke of the forced marriage, and then she told him about Thomas, the stable hand. She told him about the argument, the spit, the casual, cold-blooded murder. She told him about Barton's threat, the way he'd branded her, the reason he was hunting her. The sheriff listened, his expression unchanging. He tented his fingers, his weary eyes never leaving her face. When she was finished, the silence in the room was heavy. "That's a terrible story, ma'am," he said. Finally, he cleared his throat. "A terrible accusation." "It's the truth," Lila said. "Maybe so," Brody said, glancing at Jonas. "But it's your word. A runaway wife against Eli Barton. Do you have any idea who he is?" "I do," Lila said. "He owns the bank in Helena," the sheriff said, ticking points off on his fingers. "He owns the biggest freight line in the territory. He's got 2 judges and a half-dozen senators on his payroll. Eli Barton, he owns half this county, and you're asking me, the sheriff of a little pine-scat town, to arrest him? For a murder you say you saw, with no body?" "So you're going to send me back?" Lila's voice trembled, but not with fear, with rage. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. He stood, walked to the window. I ain't sending you anywhere. Not yet, but I can't protect you either. My advice, Mr. and Mrs. Cole, is that you do what you were planning to do. Run. Run far, because I can't hold that poster, and I can't stop him if he comes for what he claims is his." "So you're a coward," Jonas said, his voice a low growl from the doorway. The sheriff's face hardened. He turned. "I'm a realist, son, and I'm advising you to get out of my office and out of my town. For your own good." They walked back to the cabin in the dark, the whispers following them like ghosts. They didn't pack. There was nowhere left to run. They sat in the dark, the rifle on the table between them, and they waited. 2 days passed. The town held its breath. No one spoke to them. The mercantile was suddenly out of everything they needed. Jonas's logging crew found a reason for him not to come to work. They were pariahs, isolated in their small cabin, the town waiting for the inevitable. It came on the 3rd day. A noise, not a posse, not an army, just the steady, confident clip-clop of a few horses coming down the main street. Lila, who was standing at the window, peering through a crack in the curtain, went very still. "He's here," she said. Jonas was already on his feet, his pistol in his hand. He checked the load, his movements economical. "Stay inside. Lock the door behind me." "Jonas, no." "Do it, Lila." He didn't look at her. He opened the door and stepped out onto the small, rickety porch, standing at the top of the 3 steps. Lila watched from the doorway. Eli Barton reined in his horse 20 feet away, in the middle of the street. He was just as she remembered. A big man, florid-faced, dressed in an expensive black coat and hat. He looked powerful, smug. He had 3 men with him, hard-faced men with rifles resting on their saddles. The sheriff was nowhere to be seen. Barton's eyes swept over Jonas, dismissing him, and fixed on the doorway, where Lila stood in the shadows. "Well, well," Barton's voice boomed, a rich, oily sound. "The murdering dog and the runaway whore. Quite a pair." Jonas raised his pistol, aiming it steady at Barton's chest. "That's far enough. Barton, turn around." Barton laughed, a short, barking sound. He didn't even look at the gun. His eyes were only for Lila. "You really thought this killer could protect you? Your property, girl, my property." He spat into the mud. "You stole my horse. You stole my name, and you dishonored me." "She's not your property," Jonas said, his voice low and tight. "And you're not taking her." "She's already touched, you fool," Barton sneered, his face darkening with rage, finally turning his full attention to Jonas. "She's soiled goods, but she's my soiled goods." He looked back at Lila, his eyes full of a venomous promise. "You'll be begging for a quick end when I get you home, girl. But first..." His hand began to move, slowly, toward the pistol at his own hip. "You first, killer. You can watch from hell." Barton was fast, but Jonas was faster. He had been waiting for that move. Jonas's gun was already drawn, his thumb pulling back the hammer, but a louder sound split the air. Crack! The sound of the rifle was deafening, flat and final, echoing off the false fronts of the buildings. Eli Barton's sneer froze. He looked down, a strange, surprised expression on his face, just as Thomas, the stable boy, had a dark, blossoming stain appeared on the front of his expensive black coat. Right over his heart. He clutched at it, his mouth opening, but no sound came out. Jonas stood, his own pistol still raised, unfired. He looked at the doorway. Lila stood on the porch, pushed past him. The rifle, Jonas's rifle, was at her shoulder, the barrel still smoking. Her hands were not shaking. Her eyes were clear, cold, and fixed on the man in the street. She had not thought. She had not feared. She had seen the threat, the hand moving, the taunt. She remembered her lesson. Breathe out. Squeeze. Eli Barton toppled slowly, sideways, from his saddle. He landed with a heavy, wet thud in the mud of the main street. A profound, absolute silence fell over Pine Creek. Barton's men sat frozen on their horses, their rifles still in their scabbards, stunned by the suddenness of it, from windows and doorways. The entire town was watching. Jonas slowly lowered his pistol, his gaze fixed on Lila. She stood for a long second, the rifle heavy in her hands, before she finally let it down. Justice, bloody and final, had been served, and the street was quiet, waiting for what came next. The silence that fell on Pine Creek was heavier than the winter snow. It was a dead, breathless quiet. Eli Barton lay in the mud, a dark stain spreading across his fine black coat, his eyes wide and surprised, fixed on the gray, indifferent sky. His 3 hired men sat frozen on their horses. They looked at their dead employer. They looked at the woman on the porch, the smoking rifle still held in her white-knuckled grip. They looked at Jonas, his pistol still steady, his face a mask of cold granite. Their loyalty, bought with Barton's coin, had died with him. They wanted no part of this. Jonas did not lower his gun. Lila did not move. The entire town, it seemed, was watching from behind curtains, from the alleyways, from the saloon doors. Then Sheriff Brody appeared, walking slowly down the center of the street, his hand on his own holstered weapon. He stopped, his weary gaze taking in the scene, the body, the armed man, the woman with the rifle. He sighed, a long, tired breath, and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud, not far from Barton's head. "Well, ma'am," he said, his voice flat, "you've gone and done it." "He drew on us," Jonas said, his voice a low growl. He did not look at the sheriff. He was watching Barton's men. "You, on the horses, did you see him draw?" One of the men, a thin, nervous man with a drooping mustache, nodded quickly, too quickly. "He did. Sheriff, he surely did. He called Jonas a killer and went for his gun. We all saw it. She was just faster. It was self-defense." The other 2 men nodded in mute, eager agreement. They saw their escape. Sheriff Brody looked at the men, his eyes filled with a mild contempt. He looked at Barton, then at Lila. He knew, as Jonas knew, that the law had not been served here. Justice had, and it had been served by a woman's hand. He was a realist. Eli Barton was dead. His empire of fear and debt was over, and this town, his town, was now free of him. But it was not free of them. "Self-defense or not," Brody said, his voice low, for their ears only. "There's a dead man in my street, a powerful man. His name will bring questions. His lawyers will bring trouble. You ain't done nothing but buy yourselves a different kind of hunt." Lila finally lowered the rifle, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. Her arms, her entire body, began to tremble, a violent racking shudder. The strength that had held her steady, the cold rage that had cleared her vision, it all drained away, leaving her hollow. Jonas was at her side in an instant, his arm around her, holding her up. He took the rifle from her hands. "Them," Brody said, jerking his chin at Barton's men. "They can bury him, or the town can, but you two—" He looked at them, his face a mixture of pity and warning. "You can't be here. The whispers. They'll turn. They ain't afraid of Barton anymore. They'll be afraid of you, the woman who shot a man in the street, the murderer who stood with her. There's no peace for you here. There's no peace for you anywhere." He was right. They were marked, not as fugitives from a false accusation, but as true killers. They were outcasts, bound by blood and gunpowder. "Take what you need from the mercantile," the sheriff said, a final, weary kindness. "My credit. Then go. Go now. Don't let the sun set on you in this town." He turned and walked away, leaving them to it. They didn't go to the mercantile. They had no need of the town's charity. They went to their cabin. Lila sat on the cot, her hands in her lap, staring at nothing, the tremor still shaking her. Jonas moved around her, a silent, efficient shadow. He packed their few belongings into the canvas sack, the skillet, the last of the flour, the salt, his axe, the blankets. He cleaned the rifle, his movements precise, and reloaded the spent cartridge. He slid his pistol into its holster. When he was done, he stood before her. He didn't speak. He just held out his hand. Lila looked at his hand, calloused, scarred, strong. She placed her own cold, trembling hand into it. He pulled her gently to her feet. He took his hat from the peg by the door and placed it on her head, pulling it low to shadow her face. Then, together, they walked out of the cabin, leaving the door open. They did not look back. They walked out of Pine Creek, past the saloon, past the sheriff's office where Barton's men were awkwardly tying their former employer's body onto his fine horse. They walked past the staring, silent faces of the townspeople. They left the muddy street and headed straight for the high peaks. A man and a woman, a single rifle between them, swallowed up by the vast, unforgiving wilderness. They climbed. They left the valley, the mud, the scent of pine, and entered a world of rock and snow. The spring that had touched the lowlands had not yet dared to climb this high. The snow was deep, covering the game trails, hiding the passes. The air was thin and bit at their lungs. For days, they pushed upward, Jonas using his axe to cut handholds in the icy crust of the snow. They were truly, utterly alone. The world was reduced to the crunch of their boots, the burn in their muscles, and the sharp, keening cry of the wind. The land was a merciless filter. It stripped them of everything but the will to move, and it found their weaknesses. It found the old wound in Jonas's arm, the strain of the climb, the constant, gnawing cold, the lack of food. It was too much. The bounty hunter's bullet had done more damage than they knew. The scar, which had been a tight, purpled map, began to swell. It grew hot to the touch. One evening, as they huddled in a shallow cave carved from the snow, he hid a wince as he moved his arm. Lila saw it. "Jonas," she said, her voice flat. "Show me." "It's nothing, just a pull." "Show me," she repeated, the hardness she'd found in Pine Creek returning. He sighed and, with a grimace, pulled back his sleeve. The wound was angry, a swollen, weeping red that pulsed with heat. Dark red lines, like poison ivy, snaked from the wound up toward his shoulder. Lila's breath caught. She had seen blood. She had seen death. This, somehow, was worse. It was an enemy from within. "It's festered," she said, the words a cold stone in her stomach. A fever took him that night. He shivered violently. though she had him wrapped in both blankets. By morning, he was delirious. He thrashed, crying out. He was back in Texas, on the trail, shouting at the foreman's son. He was at the trading post, the bounty hunter's pistol in his face. He called for her, his voice choked with panic, though she was sitting right beside him, holding his hand. Lila became the rock. The girl who had collapsed in the snow was a distant memory, a ghost. This woman, her face gaunt, her eyes hollowed by fear and exhaustion, did not break. She was forged of the same ice and stone as the mountains around her. She left him in the cave, the pistol in his sleeping hand, and took the rifle. She hunted. She used the lessons he had taught her. Breathe out, squeeze. Game was scarce. She shot a ptarmigan, its white feathers a poor camouflage against the rocks where the wind had blown the snow clear. She brought it back, stewed it in their skillet with melted snow. She forced the thin, hot broth between his lips. She cleaned his wound. She had no medicine, only water and fire. She tore the last clean strips from her chemise, boiled them, and washed the seeping gash. He screamed, a raw, animal sound that echoed off the peaks. She held him down, her face a mask, and finished the job. She packed it with snow, as she had done before, but this time, the cold did not seem to slow the infection. She foraged. She dug for the roots of wild onions, her fingers raw and bleeding from the frozen ground. She kept the fire going. She nursed him. She hunted. She sewed his torn coat, her stitches small and tight, a desperate, mundane act against the wilderness. She became as hardened, as silent, and as relentless as the land itself. For a week, he was lost to her. He was a burning, shivering weight that she refused to let go. Then, one night, the wind rose. It howled through the high passes, a mad, lonely sound, a scream of a world that cared nothing for their small, desperate fight. In the deep of the night, the fever broke. Jonas opened his eyes. The delirium was gone. He was lucid, his eyes clear, and terribly, terribly weak. He looked at Lila, who was slumped against the cave wall, asleep but still upright, the rifle across her lap. He watched her for a long time. The fire was low, casting flickering shadows on her face. She was so thin. Her cheekbones were sharp, her skin chapped and burned, but she was beautiful. Lila, he whispered. Her eyes snapped open. She was with him in an instant, her hand on his forehead. It was cool. The fever was gone, but the weakness was a cold, final thing. He was spent. "Jonas," she breathed, a fragile hope rising in her. "The fever, it's gone." He smiled, a faint movement of his cracked lips. He raised his good hand, his arm shaking with the effort, and touched her cheek. His fingers were icy. "You're a fighter," he rasped, his voice a dry rustle. "You taught me," she said, her own voice thick. He shook his head slowly. "No, I just showed you the gun. You were always a fighter." He coughed, a shallow, wet sound that sent a JSG of pain through her. He lay back, breathing hard, gathering his strength. The wind howled, a mournful cry. "I never believed in peace," he said, his eyes fixed on her. "Not for me. I've had blood on my hands since that day. I saw it. Every time I closed my eyes, just blood. I thought that was all there was." He turned his head, looked at the small fire. "Then you, in the snow, like a broken bird, and in the cabin, by the fire, when you washed your hair." His voice trailed off, but his eyes were bright. You were my peace. Lila, I never knew what it was, until you—" She could not cry. The tears were frozen inside her. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his, her tangled hair mixing with his. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, wood smoke and sickness and the man he was. "And you," she whispered, her voice fierce. You are my freedom. You took me in. You taught me to be strong. You stood for me. She pulled back, her eyes meeting his. I would rather die here, beside you, on this mountain, than live 100 years in chains. I mean that. Jonas, I am not running anymore. He held her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw it. The guilt that had haunted him, the memory of the killing. It was gone. He smiled, a true, faint smile. He understood. He pulled her forehead back to his, and they stayed that way, listening to the wind, as the last of the fire burned down to embers. Sometime, in the deepest part of the night, his hand on her cheek went slack. She felt his breathing stop. He passed quietly at dawn. The wind had died. The silence was as profound as the silence in Pine Creek. But this was a holy quiet, the first light of the new day, pale and gold, spilled into the cave. It touched his face, smoothing the lines of pain and weariness, leaving only a deep, profound rest. The light touched his face like forgiveness. Lila sat with him all that day, her hand in his, as his body grew cold. She was empty, a hollowed-out thing, but she was not broken. When the sun was high, she took his knife and his axe. She went to a place near a small, half-frozen stream. The ground was hard, rocky, but she worked. She hacked at the earth with the axe. She dug with the knife and her bare, bleeding hands. It took her 2 days. She was a machine, fueled by a last, final act of love. She brought him, wrapped in their last blanket. She lowered him gently into the shallow grave. She filled it in, stone by stone, handful by handful, until a low mound marked the place. She found a flat piece of gray slate. For hours, she sat, the knife in her hand, carving into the stone. She carved his name, not the false one he'd used in town, his true one, Jonas Kerrigan. She stood over the grave, the rifle in her hand, his hat on her head. She said no words. There were none left. She turned and walked west. Weeks passed. The spring came for real, bursting over the high meadows in a riot of blue and yellow wildflowers. The snow melted, and the streams ran full. Lila walked. She hunted. She slept under the stars. She was gaunt, silent, a ghost in a man's hat, her eyes as old as the mountains. She was alive. She was following a game trail down into a wide, green valley when a wagon found her. A freighter, his wagon loaded with supplies, heading for the Oregon settlements. He pulled his team to a halt, his eyes wide at the sight of her. This wild woman, with a rifle slung over her back and a face burned brown by the sun. He offered her water. She drank. He offered her bread. She ate, slowly, her movements deliberate. "Where you headed, ma'am?" he asked, his voice kind. Lila looked west, toward the setting sun. "That way," she said, her voice rough from disuse. "Climb in," he said. "It's a long walk." She nodded. Once. She climbed into the back, settling herself on a stack of feed sacks. She did not speak again. She just sat, his hat pulled low, carrying the memory of a love that had defied everything. Years passed. Not in the mountains, but on the edge of a great, empty plain. Outside, the wind howls, a familiar, eternal sound. Inside, it is warm. An older woman, her hair a thick braid of silver gray, lights a candle. It is Lila. Her hands, gnarled and scarred by a long, hard life, tremble slightly as she begins to undress before the small fire. She moves slowly, her movements filled with a quiet ritual. She looks at the candle flame, and her eyes are clear. She is not sad, she is not lonely, she is remembering. She remembers a blizzard and the fear. She remembers the scent of wood smoke and the safety of a small, dark room. She remembers the feel of a calloused thumb brushing away a tear. She remembers the man who gave her peace, and the woman she became to give him the same. She undresses, not in sorrow, but in remembrance. Outside, the wind howls across the plains. Harsh, eternal, but beautiful, just like the love that once survived there. Thank you for listening to this story. Please comment where you are listening from so you can connect with others. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.